to be here and to be a part of this. I'm somewhat new to the Moon Society, and just the last couple month and a half to help to coordinate this effort on your behalf has really been terrific and really eye-opening. So I've always been a moon nerd, but this is kind of a different angle on it for me. So I'm really enjoying this. So thank you, everyone. With that, I am gonna start some of the content of our meeting. I've been involved with space research of one kind or another for 20 years. And it has been amazing, profound, the changes over the last 20 years. Talking about the moon was not cool 20 years ago. I mean, there was a little bit of interest from some administrations at some points, but there hasn't really been sustained interest in the moon for a long time. And that feels like we're at kind of a new tipping point for lunar development. And I'm very excited about that. By way of background, I think that if you look at the last 20 years and then look forward another 15 years, I think there's going to be a lot that changes. I think this is a kind of a pivotal time in human history that kind of feels like what I imagine the Renaissance might have been once upon a time, where people's perceptions of the world that they live in is either radically changing or has already radically changed. And my role in this has been to think about big ideas, big projects. I started out on the original NASA Institute for Advanced Concepts research team for the space elevator. And while that has changed a lot over that time, about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I really switched gears to focus on a lunar elevator. So that's when I started paying more attention to the moon. Well, I'm going to talk about that a lot more tomorrow, but this is the starting point for me. It was about a year ago. The National Space Council came out with a really powerful document about where we are as the United States and where we could maybe be going as a nation. Now, I want to point out that this is not, the Moon Society is not an American-centric organization. It welcomes folks from all over the world. Absolutely. And as you get to know me, I'm involved with the International Space University, so I'm definitely a globalist. But I think this document is super important, and I'm gonna put a link in the chat afterwards. It's worth reading. It's not very long, 23, 27 pages, something like that. But it lays the foundation for where the United States has decided to go. And it's important to note that while this was a document of the past administration, it has been so far accepted and continued by the current administration. So I have high hopes for it. I know that things change in DC frequently, but the National Space Council has been reinstated. Many of the directions that were established over the last 4 years, and before that, 8 years ago, many of those ideals that focus on commercialization have been maintained currently. And that's really good news, I think. So the document talks about 5 major elements: commercialization at LEO, returning to the moon to stay, extending humans to Mars, deep space science and education and workforce. Those are the big themes of it. The ones we're going to really pay attention to are commercialization of LEO and returning to the moon to stay. These ideas, to me, seem pretty straightforward, almost self-evident. But to have them come out as national doctrine, and then the ripple effects that came from that, it's called the New Era document. The ripple effects that came out of that New Era document, we're still feeling. There was an event that was held about this time last year. Well, no, I guess it was in May last year, that that a lot of very smart people got together and started thinking about the immediate future. And I think, if I counted correctly, 8 different national policy documents were formed from that event. And this is one of them, or at least, language in this was one of them. Some of the other ripple effects pushed policy into the other places in the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Department of Commerce. So these documents, when they're crafted, have ripple effects. They have powerful ripple effects, and it's really great to kind of see that happening. The guy on the left here is retired General Quast, 3-star General Quast from the Air Force. He was a strong advocate for the development of U.S. Space Force. And to not pull his quotes out of context, he's saying that the conversations we're having around space right now might truly be some of the most important conversations in our nation's history. And I pushed him on that. I asked him some questions about that. And what he's saying was, since the founding of this country, we had to make some really important decisions. But for most of the last nearly 250 years, things have kind of gone along in some sort of steady state. There's been innovation and there's change, of course, we all know that, but that the changes that we are about to face, the decisions that we're about to make, might influence the next 250 years of our nation's future. And I thought that was pretty interesting. He's an Air Force general with a focus on educating senior Air Force leaders. And so if he's talking about this interesting future, it does make me kind of pay attention. And so that was pretty powerful. And then this other guy on the right is not very well known. His name is Dr. Joel Moser. He is the chief scientist of the U.S. Space Force. And it's his actual job to look into the future and decide, what are we looking at? Now, he's coming from a national security threat perspective. So, he definitely has a bias about, what are things that the United States needs to be concerned about. So, that's his professional bias and that's his job. So, I understand where he's coming from. But what he has been working towards over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, even prior to Space Force being officially stood up, was to understand what the next 60 years look like. Sorry, 2060, the next 40 years. That's when the document was written. It was 2020. What does the next 40 years in space look like to 2060? And working backwards from that, what does the next 15 years look like to 2035-ish? And no one has a crystal ball. So, that's very hard to do. And it's fascinating to me that the Air Force at the time, U.S. Space Command, that's transitioned to the U.S. Space Force, was looking at the moon, right? The the Chinese National Space Program, CSNA, has always been a military program. Um, the the program that we usually enjoy in the United States is a civilian-run program of NASA, and then to a far lesser degree, DoD, Department of Defense involvement. Whereas in China, it's entirely the opposite. There's very limited civil space. There's becoming some commercial space. And so as China has had a space force effectively for a very long time, and as the United States and Japan and France have all developed their space forces really in the last 3 years or so, it is interesting that an aspect that we hardly ever think about, Department of Defense, thinking about the moon, that could have some really interesting, maybe unintended consequences. It might be great. I think the verdict is still out, and it will be for a long time. But I guess I'm pointing this out because there is a role of government, whether it's Department of Energy, whether it's Department of Education, and of course, NASA and DoD and those folks. There is a role of government that makes space possible. It's a catalyst. Sometimes it's called a lighthouse client that is pointing to safe paths, safe shipping lanes. Sometimes it's referred to as an anchor tenant. Certainly it is for the International Space Station. But there's other stuff happening. So the role of government, maybe I have a personal bias that maybe I don't want it to be quite as influential as it is, but it is one of the primary, if not the primary, drivers for the near future. And it's this constant cycle of current programs being replaced by potential programs. And there's always budgetary management. There's always question marks. It feels like the most important game in Washington, D.C. these days is the fight between current programs and potential programs. I tend to look at space from the perspective of kind of, one lens with 4 filters. Right? If we're going to do space, whether it's lunar development, LEO development, whatever it might be, I look at it from the perspective of kind of 4 filters. Almost everybody, almost all the time, focuses on hardware. We're going to do it at this event. We've got basically the whole day tomorrow talking about habitation on the moon. Hardware is fun. It's fun to talk about. I'm a big nerd. I like space stations and I like rockets and I like environmental control and life support systems at the really kind of systems of systems level. Hardware is some of the stuff that inspires us, right? It's what we get great pictures of. I got to tell you, I've seen some of the imagery for habitation tomorrow, and it really is quite amazing and beautiful. But less focused on, but equally important, are the other elements: business, outreach, and framework. How do we pay for it? On my last slide, I was talking about budgets at the DC level and the other governments that have the same budgetary problems and questions. That's one way to pay for it, is government support. Another way to pay for it is private capital. And we're going to be talking about that quite a bit later today and a bit tomorrow. There's a flood of new money flowing into the system. And that's really exciting too. So that's something to kind of pay attention to. How do you pay for your hardware? How do you pay for the team that puts that together and maintains it and operates it? What are your operational and management processes? What's your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, right? So that is all encompassed, and it's often ignored. Now, it's been getting a lot of attention maybe in the last 3 to 5 years, but I'm going to butcher this quote, but I think it came from Gene Cernan, although I'm not sure of that. But one of the lines of early NASA folklore was, "With no bucks, you've got no Buck Rogers." And while I might have butchered that quote, the sentiment is really straightforward. If you can't pay for it, you don't get to build the rest of the stuff you want to build. So it's not as glamorous as maybe the rest of the hardware, but it's certainly a vital element. And then outreach, what I call storytelling. This event, what we're hosting right now, is a part of that outreach, right? It's outreach for the Moon Society, but it's also outreach writ large of the space community to the non-space community, or to the Moon Society, a segment of the space community. And outreach can happen in a lot of different ways. It's everything from these sort of conferences to STEM education in the 6th grade to global summits where heads of nations and heads of space agencies meet and plan for the future. And then finally, another section that's often overlooked and ignored is the legal policy and regulatory framework that makes all of this stuff possible. If governments are currently the primary drivers for space, the laws and policies and regulations of those governments certainly has influence and power over most of those decisions. Even eventually, when commercial drivers are the primary drivers in space, they still have to operate within the framework of regulations and policies. So, The Martian, with Mark Watney from the movie The Martian, was talking about space piracy, and I got a real chuckle out of that, because someday down the road, space piracy is going to be a thing, and I don't think it's a thing yet, but it will be a thing someday. And so that framework lays the foundation for that future, hopefully without pirates. I also break the actors in space into kind of 4 sections. I jokingly refer to it as AC/DC because I'm, 53-year-old rocker that liked AC/DC. Academic, civil, defense, and commercial. Those are the primary actors in this space. It started out as a primarily academic exercise, which is why I put it first. Eventually, civil got involved, defense and commercial. Commercial is definitely a late player to the sector. Yes, of course, Boeing and Lockheed Martin were deeply involved in the earliest days of the Apollo program, but their role in developing space has shifted pretty dramatically. So that's how I kind of frame the actors. And there are a lot of nonprofits. Obviously, the Moon Society is one of those nonprofits. I usually lump them in with the civil crowd. It's not a perfect fit, but it fits a little bit. So, given those actors, given that there's national policy for the United States that other nations are also enacting or similar rules, um, given the actors, given the lens to kind of look at the problems, this is where we're going. This is where I think we're going. There's kind of 6 big elements to it. We're really, really, really good at launch now. It's taken a long time. It's taken a really long time, but we've gotten very, very good at launch. On average, we're launching a rocket, like the world is launching a rocket to space about every 3 days. Somewhere in the world, somebody's firing off a rocket. I think that is astounding. I really do. Like, just kind of let that sink in for a second. We're launching a rocket about every 3 days somewhere in the world. And not everybody's going to get the attention that SpaceX craves. And they've got a media machine that is highly tuned to their audience. But there's a whole lot of other rocketry happening beyond SpaceX. And if you can do launch really well in almost a routine manner, then communications and observation become an immediate effect of being able to launch regularly and consistently. And so we have seen, when I started 40 years ago, there were less than 400 active satellites. Last quarter, the first quarter of 2021, we launched over 700 satellites. Now, most of them are small. When I started, most satellites were big like a desk, big like a van, a minivan. Now, they're the size of a thermos sometimes, right? So, the form factors have changed, but I think we've got a really good handle on launch, communications, and observation. Like, we know how to do that really well. We went from an environment of 400 active satellites to 4,000 active satellites now, and we have a near future target of north of 40,000 satellites. The Satellite Industry Association predicts that 90 to 110,000 satellites will be constructed in the next 10 years. A lot of them are going to replace current constellations, and some of them will never be constructed. So Dr. Brian Whedon last month told me that he was anticipating 40,000 active satellites. So I think checkbox, we got that. So then once you've got a lot of launch and comms and observation satellites, then you're going to start doing something that's somewhat new. The idea of space tugs has been around for a really long time, but it's only been lately in the last year or so that you could really act on that vision. There are, I believe, 4 space transport companies out there now, and there are many more on their way. Why are there so many? Because there's over 150 known tracked launch companies. So those launch companies are going to send a lot of satellites up. Not all those satellites are going to get where they want to go because of the rideshare component of their launch vehicle. So they will use in-space transportation to get somewhere else from where they started to where they want to be in orbit. And whether that's LEO or GEO, or even to the cislunar environment of the Lagrange points, or even all the way to the moon. So that's coming. It's like near term. There's some of it happening already. There's more of it on its way. I'm a big proponent of the Lunar Elevator infrastructure. So we're going to talk about that a lot tomorrow. So I'm going to skip over it a little bit now. I will tell you that I think it's a vital element of in-space cislunar infrastructure. So I'm excited about that. There are going to be a lot of space stations constructed. A month ago, there were only 6 astronauts orbiting the world. And 2 weeks ago, we had some more flights from Chinese taikonauts, and now we've gone from 6 to 9. That's probably our current uh, limit. It's probably not our maximum threshold right now, but that's our current limit. But I don't think it's very far away till we double to having 18, semi-permanent astronaut slots on orbit. I don't think that's very far away. There are other nations considering partnering with China and the International Space Station on their various assets. And there's a lot of talk about commercial space stations being constructed. Axiom is by far the farthest along, but by no means they are not the full story. I still have some hope for the now closed Bigelow Aerospace. I hope that they closed only because of COVID last year, and I hope that they restart. They have some pretty powerful technology behind them. But I think we're going to see an awful lot of space stations constructed soon. Once you've got that infrastructure, then you can start talking about mining and manufacturing, orbital manufacturing, and harvesting resources from both the moon and eventually asteroids. And that is further down the road, but kind of an inevitable consequence of developing the moon and developing space stations to their full potential. And ultimately, if you can do all of those things and you do them well, because all of this takes mastery, there's no amateurs up in space. If you can do all of those things well, I believe you're going to start harvesting resources from the moon to build enormous solar panels that are then brought back to geo orbit and power the top 300 cities of the world. If you can power the top 300 cities of the world, then you can power, with clean, green, limitless energy, you can power 40% of the global population. And I think that is worth striving for. So I think this is how our next 15 years are going to unfold. It's going to be clunky. It's going to be hard. There are going to be missteps, but I think that's where we're going.